Well, welcome everyone. We'll get started here in a few seconds. I just want to let more of the participants be able to join. Well, it looks like we have most everyone that's signed up. So with that, Kelly, next slide. So for today's meeting, I just want to go give a highlight of the meeting format. We'll have different speakers throughout the presentation. I want to encourage you all to ask questions via the Q&A feature. You should see that on your bottom right screen. It says Q&A. The chat feature is enabled, so please only use the Q&A and post questions throughout the presentation, and we'll have pause points between each section so we can answer those questions for you. You'll not be able to ask the questions, but Kia Gillette will be the person that will be presenting those questions to the panelists and then being able to answer those. Today's presentation and exhibits are also out on the project website at northsplit.com/landscape. And we encourage you all to submit comments at info@northsplit.com. If you don't feel comfortable asking questions today, please submit your comments. And also those comments are due by December 10th. So for the meeting agenda today, we'll go through welcome and introductions. We'll go through a construction update. I'll give an update on the noise barrier color and texture results. Then we'll go through the aesthetic and enhancement implementation plan, the landscape and side slope plan overview, and then we'll go through next steps, and then we'll adjourn. Oh, I want to welcome everyone. My name is Erica Johnson. I work for HNTB, but I am working on behalf of NDOT as their public liaison to help coordinate with public information and outreach.
And I'm Mohammed Siddiqui. I work for Superior Construction as their design build coordinator for the North Split project, and I will be presenting construction update today in this presentation.
Hello, I'm Ken Boyce with Ratio Architects. I will be presenting the AEIP and the planting plans.
And I'm Kia Gillette with HNTB, and I will be moderating questions this afternoon.
I also wanted to remind everyone this is our third presentation. There is one more on November 30th at noon. So if you have a meeting or you are visiting with your neighbors during the Thanksgiving holiday, please remind them that they have one last opportunity to listen to us or ask questions directly to the panelists on November 30th. With that, I will turn it over to Mohammed.
Thank you, Erica. So as you all are aware, the project has been going on for well over a year now. Here's a quick overview of the project. On your right-hand side on the screen, you can see the footprint of the project. And essentially, the scope of the project includes total reconstruction of the I-65, I-70 North Split interchange, along with all the associated roadway and over 40 existing bridges that will be taken out and completely reconstructed. As we complete the construction, some of the biggest safety problems that were existing on the current alignment would be addressed. It would remove some of the operational deficiencies and ease the flow of traffic, removing some of the bottlenecks and which leads to congestion. Also, for the scope of today's meeting, this project includes a significant aesthetic and design improvements, which Ken will talk about in detail. And when we're all done with the project, we'll have all new lighting and signage with current standards. Moving on to the next slide. We began construction after finalizing of the design drawings back in November of last year. And here's some of the milestones we've achieved to date. As you can see on your screen on the upper right-hand corner, that's the collector distributor ramp at Michigan Street with the newly paved concrete roadway, guardrail, and all the associated features with it. This was completed in early October this year and was open to traffic on 11th of October, and it has been open since then. On the bottom right-hand corner, you can see the picture of the newly constructed bridge over St. Clair Street. The bridge is not in its final configuration because there's a lot more aesthetic features that go along with it and paint and whatnot. And Ken will be showing those in his presentation as well. Some of the maintenance of traffic restrictions that are currently in place include truck restrictions on these exit ramps. The eastbound Ohio Street to Pine Street, which has been closed down for the demolition of the bridges over CSX Railroad and Ohio Street, will be opened up next week. The Ohio Collector Distributor ramp, which is currently closed for construction, will be opened back up once the construction is completed. As part of the commitment to the project, we had to keep open one of the two ramps, either Michigan or Ohio, open at all times. So while Michigan was open, Ohio was closed, and now that Michigan is open, Ohio is closed. Yeah, moving on to the next slide. As you can see there, here's all the side streets that will get new bridges on them. Alabama Central College, Commerce, St. Clair, Vermont, Michigan, 10th Street, Lewis Street, New York Street, Market Street, and Washington Streets will all get new bridges and aesthetic features associated with them. One last thing before I conclude my part of the presentation is, as you can see on the picture on the screen, we're trying to utilize a lot of the existing spaces between the current alignment of the road to build as much as we can offline and not interrupt the flow of the traffic. The piers that you see on your screen are for Structure 34, which is the longest bridge and the highlight of the project. Once it's completed, it'll have over 10 spans, almost 800 feet long. It'll have associated aesthetic features with that as well. With that, Erica, I'll give it back over to you.
Thank you, Mohammed. I'll give a brief overview of where Superior Construction will be building the noise barriers. This map right here shows Wall 3W, which is just on what we call the east leg of the interchange. So to the west is the interchange, and then to the east you see Commerce, and then on to Keystone to kind of orient yourself. As part of the color and texture requests, those properties that are highlighted that were benefited from the noise barrier were provided the opportunity to give their survey results on color and texture. Next slide, please. This is the Wall 3E from Commerce to Valley, and those are the properties that you can see that were impacted, that were selected for their input. From that community survey process, the residents provided input in June of 2021. The survey results were tabulated from the return postcards, and pattern 1, ashlar stone up on the upper right, and color 1 here on the bottom right were selected. Superior Construction anticipates beginning the noise barriers in summer of 2022 and would be finalized substantially complete by November of 2022. With that, I will turn it over to Kia. If you have questions, please post them now.
We're going to pause for just a moment to see if we have any questions come in. Just as a reminder, your Q&A button is if you go to the bottom of your screen, there's a little button that says Q&A, and you can type questions in there. We had a question. We do have a question. Will there be noise barriers in the Old North Side as well? And I'll go ahead and answer that. As part of the environmental review process, we did take a look at and analyze a barrier near the Old North Side, but that was ultimately determined to not be a reasonable barrier, and there will not be a noise barrier constructed along the Old North Side. And if you would like to know more about the history of the noise analysis, that final noise analysis technical report is available on the northsplit.com website. Question about the noise barrier. Again, what made it unreasonable? There were a few factors that went into that. Part of that was input from the benefited receptors in that area. Also, there was a concern that there would be a visual effect to the Old North Side Historic District. And that is detailed in that final noise report if you'd like more information. We do have another question. Are there any areas where the footprint of the new inner loop will be smaller than the old? And I'm going to direct this one to Mohammed. I don't believe so, but I'd like Mohammed to weigh in on that.
Sure, I'll try my best, Kia. Essentially, if you're looking for the square footage wise in terms of pavement areas and whatnot, it would probably remain unchanged, but the alignments are, for lack of a better word, getting squeezed towards the middle. So visually speaking, I think there will be definitely a difference. But if you want a technical analysis, I think it would probably remain the same.
So Mohammed, just to confirm, the width would be very similar to what it is today, maybe a little wider in spots, but all work would be in.
Yes, alignments are changing. So locations of those alignments might be different than what it is right now. So some places it might be one way or the other, but no, the footprint itself would remain the same.
Okay, and just to kind of clarify, all work is going to be done within the existing right-of-way. There will be no additional right-of-way acquisition as part of the project.
That is true.
We do have a follow-up question. Is it possible to revisit the noise barrier decision on the Old North Side? No, at this point, the decision is final for now, unless another project that would trigger a noise analysis would be done on this area of the interstate. So barriers over east of the interchange will be constructed, and the barrier that was adjacent to the Old North Side will not be constructed. All right, we're going to keep moving. There will be more opportunities for questions as the presentation progresses. Ken, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So I'm going to speak to the Aesthetic and Enhancement Implementation Plan, or AEIP, as many of you probably have heard it referred to. The AEIP shows how the aesthetic design guidelines that were developed during the environmental and planning processes are implemented in the final design. It further develops the aesthetic elements of the project based upon the final infrastructure design. The heights, widths, lengths of the constructed elements, for instance, would be illustrated within the AEIP. And we developed the guidelines based upon constructability issues, also determining the best construction methods given the materials and the final infrastructure design. The AEIP was completed by the design build team, and it includes things like underpass treatments, retaining wall and bridge treatments, plantings, and lighting. Next slide, please. Like the aesthetic design guidelines, the AEIP is broken into two general areas. One is infrastructure elements, including hardscape, walls, piers, lighting, underpasses, and other construction items directly associated with the bridges and the roadway. And then landscaping elements or plantings within the project area, side slopes, the interchange, and the west, east, and south legs. The construction on some of the infrastructure elements has begun. Those of you that are local have seen some of the infrastructure enhancements already built. Other infrastructure elements and plantings will be included in future work over the next year or so. Next slide, please. So we'll talk about the AEIP infrastructure elements next. Next slide, please. So the relative to the underpass construction and bridge openings, construction has begun at some underpasses. Most of the work will occur once the bridges are completed. So you can see an initial image of the St. Clair Street Bridge partially constructed many of the enhancements are yet to come. Next slide, please. The aesthetic design guidelines developed a set of underpass treatments that the various bidders were to follow, and the Superior team has done that. They addressed things like a number of the bridges will require the monuments at all four corners of the bridge. For instance, you can see in this image, it was part of the design guidelines, street names being incorporated on the barrier on top, some fairly wide pedestrian sidewalks, and other pedestrian facilities. Next slide, please. So a major gateway bridge application will occur at 10th Street. So this major gateway designation was done within the design guidelines, and the AEIP then sought to apply those guidelines to this specific structure. You can see the span is a fairly wide span on 10th Street. They have the major monuments at all four corners. Otherwise, the character of the 10th Street Bridge is very consistent with the image we saw from the design guidelines. Next slide, please. Next slide. Oh, College. Okay. So the College Avenue Bridge is one that has a much shorter span, but again, it's a major gateway element or bridge opening, and it has the monuments at all four corners of that bridge also. So we'll run through a few more of the various bridges. Next slide, please. And then we have the Washington Street Bridge that we've illustrated here. Again, it's a major gateway with monuments at all four corners. The street name on the barrier again, and you can see with the particular Washington Street Bridge, not only is it a fairly long span, but it also has a longitudinal slope to it. So the monuments were adjusted to account for that slope. Next slide, please. The design guidelines identified special paving treatments for walks that pass underneath the bridges, and so there were a number of particulars of the pavement that were specified within the design guidelines, and then the AEIP sought to implement them. So next slide, please. The AEIP made some refinements to specialized paving, finalizing the materials and patterns, and all reviewed based upon constructability issues. Next slide, please. So the aesthetic design guidelines identified special lighting treatments for the walks through the underpasses. There's uplighting that was required within the design guidelines, and some downlighting also. You can see some character representations, images of the intended design result. Next slide, please. So going from the design guideline graphics to the AEIP, part of that process included the picking of the actual fixtures that were consistent with the character that was identified within the design guidelines. We have some uplights, floodlights for things like the monument lighting. And then we have downlighting on the walls underneath the bridges, so that we get a well-lit pedestrian zone under the bridges, and makes it feel more comfortable for the pedestrians after dark. Next slide, please. So the general pier aesthetics were defined in the aesthetic design guidelines. You saw Mohammed spoke a bit to the piers on the large bridge structure that's partially constructed. And so within the design guidelines, there was a general character established that included some reveals and some battered faces on a portion of the piers and so forth. So next slide, please. So then the aesthetic enhancement and implementation plan took that character, was generally established in the design guidelines, and we applied it to the actual structures that were engineered for installation. So you can see a very similar character to the piers. The reveals have been kept, and the end treatments on the piers are very similar, battered faces and so forth. So quite similar. Next slide, please. So as a part of the process, Superior Construction has built full-size mock-ups of the stems on the piers. You can see the reveals here in a portion of that pier. These mock-ups were built to verify shape and dimension of the piers, test and verify finishes and colors, and test and verify textures on the piers. So a very nice step in the process. Next slide, please. This is the cap of the piers. Again, full-size mock-ups were produced and reviewed by a number of people. Again, testing the textures and colors and finishes and so forth. So very nice result. Next slide, please. And this is a close-up view of one of the piers that has been built, very similar to the character established within the design guidelines. The reveals do a nice job of creating some interest with the shadow play and so forth, and then the battered faces are quite elegant. So next slide, please. And then form liners were developed and approved to create full-scale mock-ups of the MSE wall panels. So a number of people reviewed the mock-ups again for color and texture and finish and so forth. So another quality control step in the process. Next slide, please. And then this is an image, a close-up image of the abutment at the St. Clair Street Bridge that's been built. So you can see a portion of the aesthetic enhancements are in place with lots more of the MSE wall to come. Next slide, please.
Okay, we're going to pause for just a second to answer some more questions, and we've got a few of them. So let's get started here. We have a question about noise. Will there be other plans to reduce noise in the Old North Side from the highway? That's a good question. And yes, NDOT has considered noise as they're constructing this project and in the final configuration. What I mean by that, there are a few things that they're doing in attempt to reduce noise that would be not a sound barrier. So what they're doing is they're replacing the bridges, or most of the bridges. And I don't know if you've ever walked underneath one of these bridges, but it's very loud and it makes kind of a clanging noise because that's some of the bridge parts banging together, especially as some of those trucks go over. So replacing the bridges should help reduce that noise. What they're also doing is using what's called next generation concrete grooving. And in what we would consider to be maybe traditional concrete roads, the grooving is horizontal across the road. What we're doing for this project is making the grooving longitudinal. So it's kind of going in the direction that your tires are traveling. And that should also help to reduce noise throughout the project area. Okay, we have another question, and we actually have a couple of questions here. And Erica, I'm going to direct these to you. Are you able to communicate the suggested directions to apps? And I'm inserting this here. I'm thinking what she means is like Waze or Google Maps that direct people through the work zone. We're getting semi trucks inside Lockerbie on our brick and cobblestone streets. And hold on, Erica, I'm going to have a follow up because we have another similar question. Where should questions unrelated to today's topic, such as the trucks, There's an incredible volume of semis exiting on Michigan Street that then turn left onto East Street, that are driving over sidewalks or cutting off cars in the turn lane. Is there somewhere they could actually direct those specific questions about the trucks?
Okay, for the first part of the question on the apps, yes, we have been coordinating with Google and Waze and Apple. And we've been taking pictures and notifying the apps if there are any inconsistencies with any of the directions of the traffic that they have, because we've changed some direction one-way streets to a different way, as well as then the road closures themselves. So we have sent that. So anything that's out on traffic or 511.in.org is then also relayed to those apps to pick it up. Of course, we can only give them the information, and we do that regularly, but we also send notifications when they miss some things. It does take them time to update. The second part of the question, for the trucks, we have let the city know, and that is more of an enforcement issue on the trucks. We have been pulling over trucks. We have those no truck restriction signs up on the exit ramps for Michigan, as well as for Washington Street. And the Indiana State Police has been pulling those over and enforcing that. We also have a weight restriction map that we've been giving to those truck drivers. So the state police have been handing that, and that map was created by the city as well. For any additional truck information or issues that you see out while you're driving or by your residents, please use ndotforyou.com to send that to us and the public information team. That comes to myself and Andy Dietrich and others here on the panel for us to review those comments and then work with the state police and also notify the city for enforcement requirements.
Thank you, Erica. Another question, I think this is about noise. Were the residents of 12th and New Jersey given a voice in this? The project followed NDOT's noise policy. And if you're curious about what NDOT's noise policy is, it is available. If you just Google NDOT noise policy, it pops up and you're welcome to review it. So we followed this policy. And the purpose of the policy is to make sure that NDOT is consistent with applying their policy regarding noise and noise barriers across the state. So benefited receptors. So those receptors near the sound wall that would be benefited, and that has a specific definition under the policy, were sent surveys as to whether or not they were in favor of a noise barrier or not at that location. All of this is documented in the report. So I know I keep sending you back to the website for the report, but there's a much better summary in that document. There was also a public meeting in the Old Northside neighborhood as part of that public involvement process for that barrier. Have another question about the bridges. So I'm going to head this to Ken and possibly Ron Taylor. And Ron was involved in the development of the aesthetic design guidelines that kind of fed into where we are now. So the question is, some streets, College, for example, have multiple bridges next to one another. Do the designs being shown apply to all the bridges on College or just the outer bridges?
So the answer to that question is just the outer faces of the College Street Bridge. Ron, if you want to clarify anything, feel free.
I think in terms of like the monuments that you see, that is correct.
Okay, we do have another question also about bridges. And Ron, I'm going to direct this one to you because this was kind of about, this is probably more an aesthetic design guidelines question than it is where we are now in design. And it says, adding street names to bridges overhead seems misleading or superfluous, as the names identify the streets passing under the bridge. Presumably, people already know what street they are on. Can the text indicate which neighborhood one is entering by passing under the bridge instead of the name on the street, which you are already traveling on?
It's a good question. So during the aesthetic design guidelines, where we were starting the discussion about what should appear on there, the idea of actually labeling, Interstate 70 or Interstate 65 across there, there was a little bit of pushback on that. The idea that people knew what that was and really was interested in I think people were interested in trying to find that local tie. There were some early discussions about neighborhood names. There were discussions about districts. There were some discussions about other ways that could be applied. And I think in the aesthetic design guidelines, where we landed was keeping that local street name in there as it started to move into design and construction. So I don't know the exact answer in terms of where they are in the specifying of that exact lettering is. But I think that we're certainly still willing to sort of take your comments if you've got comments.
Just to follow up, Ron, when the discussion about naming bridges, I thought it had been determined that the neighborhood name was the choice.
No, that's not accurate. In coming out of the public meetings and all of that, the design guidelines were the result of the input that we received through that process. And at that time, I think there were some concerns about the difficulty in making sure that the neighborhood names were going to be correct, and that each one of these bridges actually served as a gateway to that neighborhood. So it was still a detail that was it hadn't been resolved to change it to neighborhood names at that point.
Okay, we don't have any questions at this point. There will be more opportunities later for additional questions if some arise. We're going to keep going. So Ken, I'll pass it off to you to talk a little bit about the landscape and planting plan.
Thank you. Next slide, please. Okay, so as a part of the design guideline development process, there were a series of what they referred to as landscape typologies. Back one slide, please. That were developed, and the purple, the image on the right hand side here, the purple color designates areas that have existing plant material in them that were deemed worthy of keeping, and so those are do not disturb areas. The yellow is a turf grass buffer area that's intended to be used in places where we need, for safety reasons and so forth, need a mowable lawn. So it's a turf grass, not unlike what you might find in some people's yards. And type 3 typologies are the side slope typology or plantings. So essentially the slope that is present throughout much of the interstate system, the project area, are planted with side slope plantings, and that includes everything from shade trees, ornamental trees, to shrubs, to meadows, including native grasses and wildflowers. The red are screen plantings that are specific to areas adjacent on the residential side, adjacent to the sound barriers. So that's a special designation that was intended to screen the sound barriers a bit more than they would be otherwise. Type 5 typology interchange plantings are plantings that are specific to the interchange itself. And then type 6 is a detention basin planting, which is just a mix of material that will go into the area of the detention basin, which is on the north side of the interchange. That those plantings are specific to places where they'll be inundated with for short term with water, and they'll be able to sustain themselves through those short periods of inundation. Next slide, please. So these are some examples of some meadows that you might find similar to what will be planted on much of the project area. So when we say native grasses and forbs or wildflowers. This is the kind of typology, landscape typology we're referring to. Next slide, please. So the design guidelines develop these areas and designations of different typologies for the various legs and interchanges areas. And the EEIP and planting plans sought to develop that character. So next slide, please. We have illustrated for today's purposes a portion of the west leg planting plans. So we just took the planting plans and added a bit of color for illustration purposes. I'll just quickly on the south side of the interstate, you'll see larger dark green circles. Those are canopy trees. And the smaller reddish colored trees are ornamental trees. The lime green color is a typology 3 plantings, which in this particular case is native grasses and wildflowers. So I have that on both sides. And then the tan color is the do not disturb areas. Next slide, please. So we have drawn a section through this particular area. This is adjacent to the Old North Side and St. Joseph historic districts, and intended to sort of give you a bit of a three-dimensional representation of what those plantings are actually going to look like. So I'll just start on the right side of the image. In this particular area, this is the right-of-way line on the far right side, which is going to be typical to most of these sections you see. There's an existing vegetated area there that is going to be kept. So a do not disturb area. And adjacent to it, we have a type 3B typology of wildflowers and native grasses. You go to the other side of the section, again, where it's a right-of-way line, we have some existing plant material in that zone, an area of plantings that will be preserved and do not disturb area, and then some typology 3B plantings of native grasses and wildflowers adjacent to the travel lanes. Next slide, please. So again, this is on the west leg, but it's immediately adjacent to the interstate or the interchange, excuse me. College is on the right and then going west from there. So you can see in this particular plan that the shade and ornamental tree plantings, the do not disturb areas, and then the rust color is a new one. It is a type 5 typology where trees are restricted for sight lines and so forth, motorist safety. Next slide, please. Again, here we have drawn a section to illustrate, give you a bit of a sense of what that's going to look like in a three-dimensional sort of way. So on the right side, you can see where the section is drawn here. It's looking east on the south side of the interstate. On the right side, the right-of-way line, and then we have a do not disturb area there of plantings in that particular area, and then type 3 plantings between the do not disturb area and the eastbound travel lanes. So that's composed of canopy trees, ornamental trees, shrubs, native grasses, and wildflowers. Next slide, please. So this is the interchange itself, design guideline document, and sets out the general intent of the application of the landscape typologies. Next slide, please. This is the northwest portion of the interchange in the area of the detention basin. So you can see the manner in which the canopy trees and ornamental trees are applied. The dark green is a typology 5 landscape. It's an open area with native grasses and wildflowers. And then the yellow is the mobile lawn, and it's surrounding the detention basin for the purposes of maintenance access and allowing NDOT to get in there and maintain that pond edge. So the rust color again is the type 5 typology that has restrictions for tree plantings for motorist safety. Next slide, please. Okay, so the image on the right would be the southwest portion of the interstate interchange. And again, you can see the graphics here are very similar to the graphics I've been speaking to. So you can see the application of the canopy trees and ornamental trees. The mobile lawns, you see here some mobile lawns that are on either side of a drainage swale. So again, this is intended to allow NDOT to have full access to maintain that drainage swale. The rust colored is a type 5 typology that has a tree restriction associated with it, just due to motorist safety concerns. And then the type 3B side slope plantings that are present in some of the locations where we have some open areas and tree restrictions. Next slide, please. So this is a section that is cut in the area of the Massachusetts Avenue Historic District. You can see from this section, it's very similar graphics, starting with the right of way on the left side, but going across a series of travel lanes on the right side. We have a walk a proposed walk that's in the right of way at that point, turf grass on both sides. And then we get into the type 5A plantings that includes canopy trees, ornamental trees, shrubs, native grasses, not shrubs in the interchange, sorry, extract that, canopy trees, ornamental trees, native grasses and wildflowers. And then back to turf grass on the right side. Again, there's a drainage swale there, so the turf grasses are adjacent to the drainage swale for access purposes, and then native grasses and wildflowers adjacent to the travel lane. Next slide, please. And then we're going to speak a little bit about the area in what would be the southeast portion of the interchange. Similar graphics here on the right side. You can see how the tree plantings are represented. Again, mobile lawns in areas that are required for maintenance access, and then a lot of native grasses and wildflowers on the ground plane. Next slide, please. So this is a section cut through the side slope in the area of the Monon Trail on the east side of the interchange. So starting on the right side, we start at the right of way line, we come across the Monon Trail itself. We have turf grass on either side of it. And then the 5A plantings that are associated with that area, canopy trees, ornamental trees, native grasses and wildflowers. And the native grasses and wildflowers will just continue up to the interstate travel lanes. So on the ground plane, you'll see a pretty continuous planting of meadow grasses and forbs, and then in specific areas planted over the top of that with canopy trees and ornamental trees. Next slide, please. So the east leg, we're on the east side of the interchange now with this image. And again, the design guidelines laid out many of the areas, designated certain kinds of plantings, and unique to this area would be the rust colored or the reddish color associated with the sound wall screening. So that's something that is unique to the east leg. Next slide, please. So you can see the planting plans, the illustrations associated with the plantings of the trees, the native grasses and wildflower areas, the mobile lawn areas adjacent to drainage swales and the travel lanes. And then next slide, please. We'll cut a section here for you, and we'll just start on the left side of this image at the right-of-way line. We have some turf grass, about 26 feet of turf grass, and then into a type 3 planting area of canopy trees and ornamental trees, shrubs, native grasses and wildflowers underneath. And then the type 4 typology, which is unique to the areas of the screen wall. So this dark vertical line is one of the screen walls. And so there's a different mix of plant material that is going to be used in these areas, with more evergreen shrubs and trees being used to provide a more of a year-round screening of the sound barrier. And then turf grass between the travel lanes and the sound wall. And on the right side, we have turf grass typology starting at the right-of-way line, and it transitions to the type 3B, which is the native grasses and wildflowers. Next slide, please. And now we're looking at the south leg, just south of the interchange. And in this particular case, north is up, or to the left, I'm sorry. Again, this is displaying the intent of the design guidelines. Next slide, please. So here's an illustration. The graphics are very similar to what we presented already. So you can see how the trees, the canopy trees and the understory trees are planted. The turf grass buffers along the drainage swales, and then the type 3B side slope plantings, native grasses and wildflowers. Next slide, please. And there's a section here that's cut in the vicinity of the Lockerbie Square Cottage Home Historic Districts. And very similar to what we've talked about already with the other sections, but turf grass adjacent to the right-of-way line, and then type 3A plantings on the side slope, with some type 5B in this particular area adjacent to the travel lanes, which the type 5B has restricted tree applications. And on the right side, turf grass typology, and then a topology 3A, which is the full gamut of the canopy trees, ornamental trees, shrubs, native grasses, and wildflowers. And then a section of type 2 typology, and then a section of the 3B, which is the native grasses and wildflowers. Next slide, please. So we're further south on the south leg, down the very south end of the project, design guideline direction that was established. Next slide, please. And then an illustration in that general area, just to give you a bit of orientation. So this is the interstate off ramp onto Ohio Street, and then Ohio Street going underneath the bridge and transitioning to Pine Street. So again, you can see how the canopy trees and ornamental trees are deployed with turf grass buffers and native grasses and wildflowers. Next slide, please. The section through that side slope, starting on the right side, this is again in the vicinity of the Holy Cross Westminster Historic District. So the right-of-way line on the right side, turf grass buffer, and then new plantings, type 3A plantings, which is canopy trees, ornamental trees, shrubs, native grasses and wildflowers, and it transitions into a 3B, which is native grasses and wildflowers. Next slide, please.
All right, we're going to pause for just a second, and we do have quite a few questions. Ken, I'm going to start with you, and I've got two similar questions. So I'm going to ask them both, and then I'll ask you to answer if that's okay. So the first, and they're about evergreen trees. So the first is there was a request for evergreens added to reduce the effect of when leaves drop off in the winter. Will that be in the mixture? And next question is, according to the stage 3 planting plans, there appears to be only one area where evergreen trees are used. Is there a reason why more of the landscape treatments typologies do not include evergreen trees? They are essential for screening, buffering, and visual interest in the winter months. I would suggest that the ratio of evergreen trees to deciduous trees be significantly increased in all tree planting areas.
Yeah, I can make a pass at this, and then Ron may want to add some clarification too, because some of this is probably more directly related to design guidelines than it is the AEIP or the planting plans. But the only place that we're intended to use evergreens has been adjacent to the sound barriers. So that was, to the best of my recollection, that was the directive from the design guidelines, and Ron can clarify that if that's not the case. But generally speaking, the intent was to develop a planting design that's specific to the place of Indianapolis. And so native canopy trees and ornamental trees are used throughout, and not a lot of evergreen. So, Ron, is there anything you want to add to that?
No, I think you're accurate.
Okay, next question. Why are there no quality trees to be planted on the north side of the west leg along 12th Street? The only vegetation there are weeds and trash trees in poor condition. The south side looks like it will get a lot of new quality vegetation. Why is the north side being treated differently? It's pretty unattractive. We stare at this every day. It was really not intended to treat different legs of the interstate completely differently. There were concerns that were voiced during the environmental review process about removing those existing more mature trees along the north side of the west leg. So they were marked as do not disturb where we could, if we could avoid them from a construction standpoint. And the purpose was really to provide visual screening, keep those trees there to provide visual screening from the neighborhood to the interstate if we could. So it wasn't intended to short the north side at all. It was actually intended to try to preserve the mature vegetation that was there. And I'm going to follow up about a similar topic. Many trees were removed along the north side of the west leg, bordering the old north side along 12th Street from Alabama to east of Central. These trees provided an important screening and buffering function. It appears the only plantings to be placed in this area are ground plane plants. Can these areas include more trees to restore the screening buffering function of the former tree canopy that was removed? The answer to this question is it depends. If this was within 20 feet of the new interstate, per NDOT and federal highway guidelines, we are not planting within 20 feet directly adjacent to the interstate. So that Ken, correct me if I'm wrong, but if that's the case, that's where we're planting the herbaceous vegetation. If that's not the case, please feel free to send us an email and we will look into where that vegetation was removed and see if it could be planted. More trees could be planted in that area.
Yeah. So, Kevin, there's another overlay here. You can find those issues laid out inside the planting plans that are available for review. So there, where we have a 2-to-1 or greater slope, the decision was made that we were concerned about jeopardizing the slopes with plantings of trees and so forth. So those are very steep slopes. And we are not planting on trees in the areas of 2-to-1 greater slopes.
All right. Another question, and Ken and Ron, I will direct this to you as well. This is about trees along the new Monon Loop. So approximately 20 plus large caliber mature trees in O'Bannon Park were cut down on the north side of the trail. That was replaced as part of the Monon Loop construction in March to May 2021. How and where will these trees be replaced? At what ratio will these trees be replaced? The stage 3 planting plans are not clear on how or where these trees are to be replaced.
Is this one for me?
Oh yeah, sorry, I was directing. I thought we were planting along the Monon Loop, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, so Jeff Pitts, if you may be more familiar with that specific issue, but let me read this questionnaire carefully so I make sure I can answer it directly. But O'Bannon Park, look at that. I'm not familiar with the trees that got cut down, so we'd have to get back to you on that specific question.
There were trees that were removed as part of the Monon Loop construction. I think we're just wondering if we're replanting there or where we're replanting.
Yeah. So,
hey, Kia, I'd like to speak up here a little bit. Yes, those trees were cut down. We had to cut those down to build the loop. And I don't believe there was a requirement to replace anything we cut down. It's just, and the other thing to keep in mind too is in the original layout that we had gotten from the owner, meaning NDOT, there was going to be a lot more trees to have to been cut down, but we went out of our way to save as many of the trees as we could if it made sense to move the trail 5 foot this way or 5 foot that way, so we would not have to cut any of the trees down. So even though we did cut 20 down, we limited the amount that were to be cut down. As far as whether they're being replaced or not, I would have to look at the planting plans as well. I mean, I know there's a lot of trees going in the infield. I just don't know exactly how many we're planting. I know there's over 5,000 trees at some point on this project. And there's a whole bunch of different types and all the other stuff. That's all I know.
Ron, correct me if I'm wrong. I thought we had plans to plant trees north of the Monon Loop.
Yeah, so I believe that the amount of distance between the edge of the Monon Loop and the edge of sort of the park proper was somewhat limited, but there was an effort in the stage 3 design plans to make sure that even if we could only get a single row of trees, to try to get some trees along that northern edge of the Monon Loop. And those are in, I think, the stage 3 planting plans.
I think that's correct, I do believe.
Kind of a follow-up, can more tree plantings be added along the Monon Trail? Why 32 feet width of just turf grass here? Seems like a missed opportunity to add shade, tree canopy, habitat, etc.
So you want me to answer that then, Kia?
Sure.
So there's areas of open lawns and meadows and so forth that have been layered in, and that was part of the design guidelines. And we, with regard to why we have no plantings along the Monon itself, Jeff Pitts, are you able to chime in on that one? I think there was a buffer that was required, but Jeff would know more specifically, maybe. Jeff? We can answer follow up, look at the plans more carefully, Kevin. There's a lot of layers of requirements for different areas within the project. So we'll take a look at that specific area and then get back to you.
Yeah, there may also be some limitations in that area over property ownership because there's two different swaths of ownership that covers the kind of the corridor of the Monon, and then there's an adjacent property that's owned by a separate rail corporation immediately adjacent to that. So that may have also been one of those layers that Ken's talking about.
Okay. Regarding evergreen trees, it seems that conifers could help mitigate the sound burden of the Old North Side and other districts lacking the barrier wall. Can they be used more heavily? And as a follow-up, so as to the response on evergreen trees, will there be any added to the other typologies? Is that something at the very least we could take a look at and consider doing?
I think we're following the design guidelines. So if there's any latitude within the process for us to change that, we'll consider it. But I don't think it's it's not up to me to determine that. So, Ron, is there any ability to have some latitude with that?
I think from the design guidelines aspect, we're able to reconsider species and some of those things. We'd want to look into it a little bit more, but I think that as it moves through the design process, we'd probably be more concerned about if there are some areas that the conifers would create adverse effects or some sort of condition that we didn't want. But we can certainly, I don't know that we have a hard line drawn and saying there's no way we can think about that at this point.
Yeah. So should it be feasible, then we can consider it. But I will tell you that specifically we're trying to create an installation that carries with it a strong sense of place. And so I think the initial design guidelines directive was a good one, very reasonable to use native plant materials. So, that's part of the process that got us to where we are now. It's not that we can't reconsider it. That's how we got to where we are.
Sorry guys, I'm just trying to categorize these a little bit together. I think there's some comments about supporting the inclusion of evergreen trees. I think our response is we will take a look and we will consider it. So we'll keep going here. Many of the existing trees are now gone. Not much screening is happening now. Can we revisit this? I think that this is in reference to the Old North Side. We are not going to remove trees that are there now in the do not disturb areas. However, if there are areas within that area that maybe are lacking trees, we may be able to plant some more trees in those areas. So if you can email those to info@northsplit.com, we can take a look at that. We have a comment that says, and this is in regards to trees that were removed along the loop. Trees removed in public parks are required to be replaced. There are trees being planted along the Monon Loop, and I guess I would throw out there that NDOT does own that property. I know it is leased to the city, but NDOT does own O'Bannon Park. But I guess trees are being planted along the north side of the Monon Loop. It may not be the exact number of trees, but on the plans, there are trees. If you're not seeing them, let me know and we'll take a look, but I remember specifically adding them. The expectation about the trees removed by the soccer field would be replaced, that they needs to be investigated. We will investigate that further, but there were trees shown north of the Monon Loop. The interpretation of the design guidelines cannot overpower the public desire. There was a strong desire expressed for evergreen during the public process. Saying now that they are not allowed feels a little like bait and switch. I don't know that we're necessarily saying they're not allowed. I think that Ken was just saying he was following the guidelines, and we will consider adding evergreens into the mix. All right, any additional questions? Erica will say this, but if you do have specific comments that you want to send to us on the landscape plans, you can send them to info@northsplit.com. All right, well, we will keep going. Erica?
Okay, well, like Kia just said, please submit comments regarding the planting plans that we just discussed today at info@northsplit.com. Also, I know there was a couple questions referencing the stage 3 plans. If you have not had a chance to review those are posted at northsplit.com/landscape. So please take a look at those. If you would rather send your comments through the mail, please send those to HMTV Intention to myself, Erica Johnson, at 111 Monument Circle, Suite 1200. And then I will have those entered into the comment tracking form. And like I said at the beginning of the meeting, comments period ends Friday, December 10th. So please have your comments emailed or directed to myself by December 10th. And then next steps, we have one more virtual meeting on November 30th. We'll review the landscape comments after December 10th and discuss those with Superior and the design build contracting team. We'll have another virtual public update meeting in early 2022. And I just wanted to remind everybody the roadway will be fully open to motorists in late 2022. And then for some of the other comments from earlier that I answered about NDOT for you, if there are other issues in the corridor that you're seeing or that you would like to comment on, please use the ndotforyou.com and the 855 NDOT for you, or email ndot at ndot.in.gov. Those come straight to myself and the North Split Public Information Team for us to address. That's just for anything that's non-related to the landscape plans. But I wanted to give an opportunity to highlight if there are other issues, please use NDOT for you. And if you haven't had a chance to check out the website for other things, we are posting regularly on the photo gallery, the video gallery, also all the road closures and detour maps on the construction info and maps page, and then also on the media page. And if you haven't followed us on social media, we do updates weekly, daily at North Split on Facebook, at North Split on Twitter, at Indy North Split on Instagram, and you also can text us at 468-311 and we'll give you project updates for the closures. Well, thank you all for joining today. Again, please visit the website for the additional information on the landscape plans that Ken, Ron, Mohammed, and myself provided information on. Thank you.